Psychologists of Reddit, what's one thing a patient has told you that caught you off guard, or vice versa, patient's perspective? Story 1. I once took a boy client who was 8 years old to the community park and went over the rules with him. Obviously, the rule of no running was identified, but then he added no pushing, especially girls' heads, over and over until they're flat dead. We left the park to discuss a few things along the lake instead. Story 2. My therapist once abruptly ended our session after telling me I needed to go to the ER. I'd been in a car accident the day before and had an undiagnosed concussion that was pretty bad. I was so out of it that I didn't even realize I was out of it. Later, he told me that I was talking about inappropriate topics. I was so embarrassed I didn't ask what I specifically talked about. I didn't want to know at that point, and wasn't making much sense. I'm just glad he recognized that I was off that day and helped me get to the hospital. Story 3. While talking to my school counselor about some mental health issues, I told him that I like playing card games to take my mind off of them. The man literally opened his cabinet and pulled out a briefcase full of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I'm a massive nerd and said, "So, wanna play?" Don't get me wrong, but this guy had a lumberjack beard, was fit, and looked more like an athlete than a counselor, so I was shocked. I got over my problems and played every Wednesday against him. Story 4. When I was a teenager, I had a therapist tell me that she didn't know what else to do to help me because it seemed like I already understood everything pretty well. This was after my overbearing and crazy helicopter mom dragged me in for being depressed. Then she switched to therapying my mom, and my mom quickly broke down in tears because she has the emotional strength of a child and wanted it to be about me when it was actually all about her. I knew exactly why I was depressed. I was stuck by myself in the middle of nowhere with her crazy ass. No personal space, no ability to get away, not being able to say no, and her getting jealous of my friends when I spent time with them. It would make anyone depressed. She didn't even let me sit with a therapist by myself. Story 5. The first time I saw a counselor, he was looking over my paperwork and said he could tell from my handwriting that I was good in bed. I kid you not. I was so caught off guard that all I could say was, I think I am. I was young and not assertive at all. I found out later that he got in trouble for inappropriate relationships with a client, but his comment really screwed me up for a bit because I have problems setting boundaries with men. Story 6. I did most of my training in a pediatric hospital. One of my patients, a young adult, was relapsing leukemia, cancer since young childhood, wanted to go to an outdoor festival with their significant other. The oncologists, on the other hand, were adamant that due to the patient's low white blood count and current course of treatment, they shouldn't let them go. Basically, if that person caught an infection, it would kill them. The patient was understandably pissed and said something like, "I've had this disease since I was a child. I know I'm going to die soon. I'm going to the concert whether you like it or not, and if I die, then at least I'll do it on my own terms." It was always quite moving when a young person expresses their own mortality and confronts it head on. I had such admiration for that person. Story 7. My therapist and I would end every appointment with a discussion of the latest Game of Thrones while it was airing. A great way to end things. Even the end of the show got plenty of light-hearted ribbing. It was great because it wasn't too personal, and after talking about sex abuse for an hour, I could leave without being such a sad sack. Story 8. In my second ever therapy session, which coincidentally was right after my nan's funeral, I was talking about some stuff that had happened with my sister, who I had already said was probably my biggest issue. And he asked, "Why is this person in your life? Why do you want to continue a relationship that hurts you so much? Do you actually want this relationship?" I was floored. It never occurred to me that my sister didn't get a place in my life by default just because she's family. I can't tell you how much this improved my life. Story 9. I'll never forget my first day of therapy. My therapist asked if I had ever been abused as a child. I replied, "No, I had a normal childhood. I had everything I needed, food, shelter. I mean, my mother slapped me and would tell me to kill myself, and my dad would drag me by the hair everywhere and pull my hair out, but no, nothing abusive or anything." There was at least 30 seconds of dead air between us as I watched her blink while trying to figure out how to respond to what I said. Eventually, she put down her file, crossed her legs, and said, "My dear, that is abuse." My world came crashing down all around me at that moment. For so many years, I had buried my feelings about what they'd done so deeply that I'd managed to convince myself that what they'd done wasn't wrong. Less than a year later, I was diagnosed with PTSD and panic disorder from the trauma, and I cut off all communication with my parents. Story 10. As a clinical psychologist in the post-doc phase of my work, I primarily help adolescents with acute mental health issues such as chronic self-injury or sexual trauma. It's common for my patients to feel a deep self-hatred, and it's painful to witness. However, I firmly believe in the power of positive regard and validation as a form of catharsis. So during therapy, I often sprinkle in comments about the admirable traits I see in my patients, such as their perseverance, kindness, or passion for their interests. I'm always caught off guard when they agree with me or say something positive about themselves, and it brings tears to my eyes. These little moments of growth make me feel like it's the first warm day after a long winter. Story 11. When I was a teenager in a psychiatric hospital, I overheard the mental health techs and nurses having their shift change meeting in the kitchen next to my room. The main tech said, "Him? Sigh, he's a mess." Although it was shocking to hear it said so bluntly, I never held it against him because I knew it was true. In hindsight, it's kind of funny. Story 12. During a therapy session, my older and normally well-spoken therapist suggested that I make a budget. He explained that just like with money, we only have a limited amount of energy to give and we need to budget it out wisely. Start with the things that are most important to give a about, like kids, work, and health. Then cross off the things you dislike giving a about, such as other people's opinions of what you wear, and don't give a about that shit. Hearing my therapist suggest that I stop spreading my so far made me burst out laughing and immediately feel better. And to this day, I still make a budget every month religiously, and it has taken so much stress off of my shoulders. Story 13. What caught me off guard? Light, a client who would randomly fart in sessions. Heavy, any medical event, entering a psychotic episode or dysregulation into violent behavior. These are all very intense moments where you just feel terrible for what the person is experiencing. I would also say that no matter how many times I've had to ask directly, I'll never feel anything but like I've been punched in the gut when someone endorses being in danger of taking their life. It's such an evocative and somber moment. Story 14. As a patient, I told my therapist that I was prescribed Wellbutrin for my depression and anxiety. My therapist said it was a medication that many adults with ADD see a positive effect with. Now, this caught me off guard and I asked why they said that. The therapist responded by saying that I have ADD, to which I was surprised and said, "I do?" The therapist explained that I present very typical ADD for adults, and I realized that it explained a lot. I got a second opinion just in case, and it turned out that I do have ADD. Thanks, doc. Story 15. When I was in high school, I was hospitalized for being suicidal. The doctor there gave me some brilliant advice that cleared things up for me and fixed me on the spot. You just have to be a normal boy. LOL. Story 16. Context. I worked from an existential perspective and at the time was working at a jail talking to a guy who hitchhiked on trains. We talked about what he could do to change his life to not just get high and ride trains. He looked me square in the eyes and told me he's freer than anyone else he comes across. He isn't indebted to a 40-hour plus work week, bills, or debts. He just hangs out with friends and travels state to state. He articulated how he knows he'll die young from a missing jump, but ultimately he'll have lived and died as he wanted to. The conversation forced me to be cognizant of human freedom and choice. He wasn't disordered, he had chosen his own path and conclusion. The only thing he was doing wrong was breaking the status quo, the law. Frankly, who am I to judge or decide how to live a life? And from then on, I was more careful to never tell a patient how to live or what to do. I'm only here to help someone think through their life and pick their desired direction. I have come to use a lot of sophist techniques to get patients to their own eureka moments. Story 17. Hopefully, someone gets to enjoy this story as much as I tried not to. I was working with the elderly in long-term care facilities, mostly nursing homes but some fancier types. This happened at a nursing home. I had this great client. She was fully verbal, talkative, spunky, and energetic. For a few sessions, I could not figure out why they had referred her to me. Eventually, it became clear. She was exceptionally delusional. She talked about how Bill O'Reilly had left her $30,000 at the courthouse and how he talked to her and was interested in her story. She talked about how her evil daughter finally brought her to the home after the police told her she had to do something with my client because she was calling the police frequently, reporting an intruder that was not there. The intruder was Eric, and Eric was a medical doctor who could shrink himself down to the size of a penny and would hide in her vents, waiting for her to go to sleep so he could perform experiments. I rolled with it. Her reality is terrifying, and no wonder she's distressed. One day I came to visit and she started with the usual, her room got moved to a park and Eric and his colleagues shrunk themselves down, and I was rolling with it again. But then she told me that they went inside her vagina, had a picnic, and she had been picking out little animal bones and fur from her snatch all day. She was pissed they didn't clean up after themselves. I think maybe I had gotten so used to the stories that I was just sort of half paying attention when I realized what she was talking about. Wait, what? They threw a barbecue in your vagina? Yeah. This is the only time I had to literally bite my lips, cheeks, and tongue to try not to laugh. Not that this woman's condition is hilarious, but a barbecue in your vagina? I wasn't prepared for that. A few weeks later, she busted out the windows in her room with her walker because she thought Bill O'Reilly was outside and the staff wouldn't let him in to see her. God, I miss that woman. She was truly great, and not because of the stories. Despite her delusions, she was sharp and witty and generally just an awesome person to be around. R.I.P. Story 18. I'm really messed up and have been hospitalized a lot. I go through moments of such intense delusions that I'm no longer myself. I was admitted once after trying to get the veins out of my arm, thinking they were wires. The doctor assigned to me wasn't really expecting me to be so paranoid. While in the observation room, he tried to talk to me and I blurted out, "What's it like being a robot, Mr. Robot Man?" I said, "Man," kind of like, "man." And he started laughing. He wasn't expecting it, and neither was I. I laughed with him. He was such a nice East Indian man, and hearing anyone with the same accent makes me feel lighter somehow. Story 19. Not a psych, a patient. I was in the hospital after having had a suspected miscarriage of a very much wanted child. Now, the hospital knew about my mental health history, so they wouldn't release me without having spoken to a psychiatrist. It was Sunday morning, so the dude wasn't on site. I was lying in a hospital bed when they brought in a phone, and the psych was on the other end. I said, "Hello," and he said, "So I've heard you've had a miscarriage." I replied, "Well, that's what they think. It's not certain yet, but..." Then the psych interrupted, saying, "So are you going to kill yourself if we send you home?" And I was like, "The fuck?" There was no empathy, or "How are you feeling about this?" or "Do you have loved ones at home?" Just like, "Let us know if you're killing yourself or not." I said, "I'm not sure, probably not." Apparently that was good enough and they sent me home an hour later. Good news though, it wasn't a miscarriage. I just had HCG levels that were low but by no means abnormal for early pregnancy. My son is now 19 months old and I decided not to kill myself. Story 20. I am a mental health worker. I was meeting with one guy for the first time. He was grandiose, which is always kind of fun, in my opinion. While grandiose, people will sometimes claim extraordinary powers, great intelligence, strength, etc. He had been showing me how incredibly high he could jump, not that high, and offering to display feats of strength if I could just give him some heavy stuff to lift. We were waiting for his treatment team to show up and maybe do a med adjustment. Then things changed. He told me he knew about me, or knew me. He started telling me things about myself professionally and some surface personal stuff a long-time client might know, but I just met this guy. At first he said he was psychic, but then he laughed and said he just knew another client I was working with, a relief. He said he knew her really well. I saw her at least once a week, had for a couple of years, and I had never heard of him. Also, I knew her to be happily married. I initially shrugged it off, but he pulled out his phone and played a video with him and my other client giggling in bed. I tried not to look at it, but I couldn't completely avoid it. He was apparently her secret boyfriend on the side. Between the details about me from this guy I had only met 30 minutes before and the revelations about my client's secret life that I had no clue about, I was thrown. It was a weird hour. Story 21. A psychologist I briefly visited to treat anxiety and depression began telling me really personal details about other clients and their sessions. Not vague stuff, but more like he was hearing voices and the voices said they wanted him to kill me, psychologist. And that was extra scary because he's the owner of local NFL team. Isn't that scary? Or she was addicted to cocaine and cheating on her husband who was the owner of local mall chain. I grew increasingly uncomfortable with these personal anecdotes and they began to take up larger and larger chunks of our sessions. By the end, I would have to interrupt her to redirect her back to my issues. After all, I was paying her to help me address them. The last straw when was she left the office for over 15 minutes to go eat lunch, then charged me for a full session. I confronted her, saying I didn't want to hear these private and confidential stories anymore and that I would prefer to stay focused on my issues during our sessions. I was hoping she could teach me how to work through them. Crazy, right? She immediately raised her voice at me and tried to tell me I was imagining the whole thing and having some sort of delusion, an issue I've never been diagnosed with or struggled with. Then she backpedaled and tried to say that all those stories had been from her imagination, meant to benefit me. I pointed out the contradiction and expressed that I didn't want to spend large chunks of our sessions talking about people in her personal life, imaginary or otherwise. That's when she cracked up and told me that I wasn't worthy of someone with her talents and could never hope to achieve mental health. I walked out and haven't been back to therapy ever since. I got into a supportive community and they helped me heal without gaslighting me or breaking confidentiality. Story 22. My psychologist's jaw dropped to the floor when I explained why a good percentage of my body was always covered in scars or bandages. It was from a mix of self-harm and from other miscellaneous things that had caused a lot of harm to me. He ended up writing it all down and it totaled to a 2-page list. The majority of it was things like broken ribs from having an aluminum canoe thrown at me when I was 4 and having been stabbed repeatedly with a Bowie knife. This caught him off guard because I apparently always seemed unnervingly calm to him and didn't outwardly show any signs of significant childhood injuries, despite one of my hobbies being boxing. Story 23. I was hospitalized a bit ago for trying to kill myself. When you do that in certain places, they can put a mandatory hold on you. I was held for 8 days at a psychiatric unit, and it was maybe the most helpful mental health assistance I've ever gotten. I had very insightful, intelligent doctors and counselors. At the end, on my last day as I was leaving, a nurse walked me out of the secure portion of the facility and into a hallway. In the hallway, all of my doctors and counselors had lined up to say goodbye on either side of the hall. As I walked down, my most favorite counselor started singing "Oh Holy Night" for some reason, and I don't know why, but I really loved it. Those doctors and counselors were so relatable and down to earth, and I felt so awful when I got there. I was so much better when I left. Story 24. Told mine I had seen him grabbing a drink at the same place I used to go get drunk before COVID. He stared at me like I had discovered something NASA was hiding. We had a laugh and he confessed to it. Context, I had a huge drinking problem and he told me he didn't like to drink at all. Story 25. There's nothing I can do for you. Your problems are untreatable. I was 11. The honesty is now appreciated, but at the time it was so traumatic that I repressed the memory of hearing that and acted out so horribly that Toronto healthcare people have seen me as the enemy ever since then. Story 26. I paid and sat through an entire session of therapy during which my therapist ranted as to how great of a career he could have had as a stand-up comedian and how much he regrets his current profession. I kinda agreed with him near the end.